We chose together to speak on something that sounds very complicated and sad and doomsday-like: environmental rights, political corruption in India, and the climate imperative. Quite often, when we hear or speak on issues of environment and climate change, it seems like nothing is working and everything is falling apart. Most of our conversations tend to be about how the world is not working the way it should be, and neither we as humans are able to do things in the way that nature is conserved, and we can live in a better relationship with nature. What I try and do is veer away from that kind of a sadness and a constant feeling of us being unable to do things, because I feel sometimes, particularly the conversations on environment and climate change, overwhelm us so much with what is going wrong that we feel nothing can be done right and therefore there's no need to do anything. And we can just continue living the way we do because the task before is so overwhelming. What I'm trying to do is break my conversation into 2 or 3 parts. One looks at how we run environmental governance in India and how the rights of the citizens in Indian jurisprudence, in Indian laws, in Indian society are protected or not protected. Second part, I look at how that plays with how our politics is run, governed, funded, and how our electoral processes particularly alter the way our environmental governance is done in India. And in the third part, in the concluding part, I try and look at how the climate change imperative, does it make us do things differently? Does the fear of what climate change brings and the impacts it's having on our societies, does that therefore require us to do things differently than what we have done so far over the past? And I start with an anecdote of the Indian forest laws. The Indian forest laws, if some of you might remember, were actually generated during the colonial period. Much of what we have as forest laws, except for the Forest Right Act, and then after the Forest Conservation Act, which is recently amended, came from the period before we got independence. It was retained in structure as it is, imposed upon a free independent India as well. And it had very peculiar elements in it, which was quite fair for others to impose upon us if they were trying to use us and run our country as a mechanism of slavery. But we imported that and brought it into the independent India itself. And I'll give one anecdote of provision of that law, which says if you or I or any one of us lives in close proximity to forests anywhere in this country, if you and I live in those areas, then we are duty bound as citizens to help protect that forest. So if the forest department came to us and said, hey, there's a forest fire behind your village in a reserve forest, I am duty bound as a citizen to help the forest department douse that fire. If I do not, I can be prosecuted. As a citizen, I can be held responsible for not helping the state do its functions. And who am I? If I am the person who lives in close proximity to India's forests or within India's forests, by default, I am one of the poorest citizens of this country. There's a fair chance I am a tribal, there's a fair chance I am a Dalit, or I come from communities which are relatively more marginalized than others. I am one of those who, by historical levels and by history, were removed from these forests, and I am the one whose rights over these forests were extinguished by the same laws. The same laws said that these forests, which earlier belonged to my people, now belong to the state to decide what's to be done with it. Very often, across vast swaths of India, my rights were actually extinguished by force without giving me an alternative to live or to my elders. And yet, I am responsible for maintaining that forest along with forest departments, along with the state, and I am held penalized and I am held responsible in case a forest fire happens. In some sense, the parallel I always think, say you and I live in a heritage house in Trichure. It's an old, beautiful old building which is now dissipating, and the state says this construction and this architecture must be preserved. And to preserve it, it throws me out of my house. It turns it into a museum for others to come and watch. It makes me the guard outside that museum. And it says, now while you are thrown out of your house, you are responsible to make sure this house looks nice. That is how the forest laws of India treats people who had initially and historically rights and control over their forests. This perverse relationship, if you look across the range of environmental laws we have, and we have several. We have the Environment Protection Act, we have the Indian Forest Act, we have the Forest Conservation Act now amended with a new Hindi name in the current regime. If you look at all of them, neither of them suggests that any citizen has a right to a better environment. All across these chapters and various provisions of the laws, we have lots of duties as citizens. It is my duty to protect the environment, it's my duty to help that, it's my duty to not do this and that. The power over environment, if it was a subject, lies with the state. What can be done, cannot be done to destroy, to reconstruct, alter, distribute the resources and the natural resources actually sits in the hands of the state. In the Environment Protection Act, for example, which is a key act where anyone who's setting up a project has to go to seek approval to do something which might pollute the air or the water or the earth. If a project is coming up in my area, which we all clearly understand will cause some damage to the environment, the best hope I have is that the state and the project proponent at some point will consult me. He or she will come once to my village, will ask me once, do you like this village? And my option is to say yes or no. But that yes or no does not eventually matter because the word is consultation, it is not consent. Therefore, the state thereafter will decide whatever it wants to do at whatever cost and help whoever it wants. Similarly, with the issues of forests, till 2006, a law said 10 to 16 officers sitting in either the state capital or the national capital amongst themselves can decide what part of India's forest will be given over to some industry or not. In that case, people would not even be consulted. Some unknown bureaucrats and a powerful minister sitting in a ministry collectively in a closed door room in either the state capital or the national capital would decide the fate of 7 lakh hectares of India's forests. You and I would come to know very occasionally, months later, that a decision had been taken. It just happened to happen that forest patches also is homelands to millions of Indians, quite literally. None of them would be consulted. Now, imagine the same thing. It's easier to imagine if this was happening in cities, where if a road was to be built by destroying your house and over your house, and your house had to be demolished. At least we have the power as upper middle class, as citizens in urban India, where the government would pretend to consult us. It would come to us and say, hey, we are going to destroy your house and we will offer you some pittance of our compensation. But there at least would be a theatre performance of a democratic process. In the case of forests, that would not even exist. In most parts of the world, we believe we are democracies. To me, this would be a classic definition of who you treat as second-grade citizens and who you treat as first-grade citizens. Which people do you believe have lesser democratic rights in this democracy compared to some? But in India, this has been in perpetuation since independence. Not much noise had been made about it by us. Most of us, and I belong to that class by now, maybe didn't start with, we elites only get worried about environment when the destruction of environment reaches our lungs, our homes, our waters, and our lands. That is what when triggers us and says, hey, something is wrong, there's too much air pollution, the water is dirty, or we're getting flooded, etc. But if you look at the entire plethora of legal systems, regulations, laws, principles, ethics, including how the constitution has been activated on this thing, you'll find Structurally, we have never recognized environmental rights of the citizens. What we have over time progressed a little too is recognize that environment is a key concern, but it stops there. We do not look upon environment even from the lens of law, justice, or equality to say if natural resources is the only way in which by exploiting that the country will grow and we have a certain degree of economic growth, then how those natural resources get expropriated, how they get exploited, how do the fruits of exploitation of natural resources get distributed amongst us as equal citizens? Are there basic principles in place for us to at least fight and argue over it in the court of law? And I would propose to you that in a 21st century democracy, regardless of what governments you have in different parts of the country or at the center, we have not even begun to imagine that kind of a legal system for ourselves. We still live in a country where at the moment, basic principles of natural justice of how resources must be mobilized for the benefit of different sections of society is not under consideration. Forget being in the law. There is a Supreme Court which has passed an order which says right to life includes right to environment. But that terminology is, that phrase is not enough for us to live our lives for the next 50 years, 70 years, saying such advancement has been made by us. This proof of the consequences of these structural problems with our laws and legal approaches to how environmental governance is done in India. If you look at records of how had the courts or the governments or anyone who had to prosecute somebody against environmental violation, how many such actions have been taken? The Environment Protection Act at some point provided that anyone who violates will pay a certain fine, might go to jail, etc., etc. If you have polluted the river, if you damage people's public health, etc. But if you look at the actual records, since that law in 1986 was brought on, we do not have more than 24 people who have ever been put behind bars for damage caused to environment under the Environment Protection Act. We do not have more than even 50 lakhs being collected from companies which have destroyed the environment over this period. And I don't think either of us need to be told the level of environmental destruction we see in our neighborhoods, in our surroundings, forgetting faraway places. There is quite literally, to my knowledge, and we've done very seriously to find out, not a single officer of any company of high rank who's ever been sent to jail for violation of the environment laws or violation of the forest protection laws. But at the same time, the same set of laws have been applied to the poorest, the marginals, and the tribals who live inside forests. And lakhs, literally lakhs of people have been sent behind bars for breaking some twig of a forest, for picking up small firewood from forests. In states like Chhattisgarh, lakhs of people have cases filed against them for damaging forests. And these are people who are just trying to live their life, who have no other option but to live off fuel wood. These are people who live off forests because other resources do not exist, and this is their primary source of livelihood. It's the same law. The law says big people shall also be prosecuted, so shall be the ordinary citizens. But the nature of the law is such that no big person or big entity has ever been prosecuted for breach of environmental laws. And this is when we have good 30 to 40 years of jurisprudence with Supreme Courts and other courts all setting forth and running hundreds of cases every year on environmental issues. You again look at the period where environmental clearances have been given. So every project it wants to set up has to go through a process of clearance. If the clearance is violated, the law says you should be prosecuted. The law also says we should look at whether this project is very good for the environment or not. Is it too damaging? In case it's too damaging, some steps should be taken to prevent the damage. If that also does not help, the project should not be allowed in the first place. And fairly, there are some projects that should not be allowed. You cannot have extremely polluting industries close to rivulets where people live. You cannot have it in the middle of forest. But the record, again, going back all the way, cutting across all kinds of government in center and state, is that 99 to 98% of all projects that go for clearance get the clearance eventually. And again, it is almost a secular trend. Regardless of who you have in power, while they might sound environmentalists when they're in opposition, when they sit in power, what they do is very similar. And we who sit in Delhi find great symptoms of this. Mostly when people get elected as politicians, as elected representatives who becomes ministers in the union government, like to go for very lucrative ministries which have large funds under them, because that gives them power to distribute money, patronage, etc. The environment ministry is one ministry that powerful ministers also like. It does not have much money, but it has power. It has power to say yes or no to different projects, industrial projects. It is almost like a licensing agency that regulates industrialization, manufacturing, service, and economic activity in the country. Therefore, ambitious politicians who get the chance love to become environment ministers instead. Because without too much money, you can actually control the economy of the nation by using and weaponizing the issue of environment. And yet, if you look at their track records, they continue to be the same. At the end, nearly every project that wants to be, who comes for clearance, does get a clearance. Some people think this is a bug in the system that can be repaired. I would propose to you this is not a bug. This is the function of the system. This is the way the system works. And there are a couple of reasons I believe behind it. One is the nature of how we see environmental laws in the country. Environmental laws in the country pretend as if it is possible to have economic development without damage to natural resources, without appropriating natural resources, or without damage to the environment. The laws pretend that there is great clarity, almost a black and white scenario where there are projects which damage the environment and projects that do not damage the environment. And these two can be turned into two buckets and cleared one way or the other. But if you learn from our own experiences and lives, every economic activity or some or the other kind thrives on creating some kind of waste refuse and absorbing some kind of raw material from the earth. And when you do that, by default, you are taking up natural resources, redistributing them, and redistributing the exit waste of it into lives of some people. That waste can be called poison and it's injected into my lungs, or it can lie in the ground or water for a while. But the environment laws pretend as if there's some black and white option available, that you can have this extreme clean growth where no damage is done to the environment. And it comes, I think, from a strange understanding of science being some puritanical subject. That science shall govern our lives rather than rational democratic processes of negotiation between you and I. It can be the same piece of land where I would like to have a project, and quite fairly, I would want to have a project to provide electricity to a village or to a city. The same piece of land can also be required by the fisher folk for the river and the fish in that river. The same piece of land can also be required by farmers to keep continuing doing their cultivation profitably. That contest for resources is not accepted as a default activity of economic growth in India by the Indian laws. And that, I think, leads us to a position where we pretend that these laws are safeguarding us, but at the end, these laws damage both the environment and the people who want to use the environment for different reasons. I'm not the one who believes that everyone who runs an industry or starts up a shop intends to pay bribes or intends to destroy environment to find the only way to work. But these laws make sure that the only way you can run your business is by what officially or technically or economically is called rent seeking, but in plain English, it is bribe giving. It is pure corruption. that the only way you can run your industries is not by actually charging the cost of environmental damage, but paying some powerful people some price to run your factories, your industries, your projects in a less environment friendly fashion. And that sets up the debate where you have all industrialists who look ugly, who hate what they do, but they continue to do because it's the only way for economic growth. The environment which suffers with every project that comes up, and the people whose health suffer with every project that comes up, because the regulatory systems themselves ensure that citizens are fighting amongst themselves rather than justice being given. There's a lovely old going case in the Supreme Court, and we have a joke about it. Every new Chief Justice who comes to the Supreme Court loves to be treated as he's pro-environment because all journalists then love to write about him or her as this very progressive judge. So each judge, almost everyone without an exception, therefore picks up one environment case. Say, typically because the Supreme Court is based in Delhi, it is about the river Ganga. If it was based here, it would have been about Periyar or some other river. But if not, it is about Ganga. Every Supreme Court judge somehow ends up listening to one case about river Ganga. And then he has or she has long sentences to make about how river Ganga is holy, yet it should not be polluted like this. The case goes on for years. By the time the judge retires, the river's condition is even worse than how it started. But the judge has got accolades and awards for being very green. And he goes on. Even during his tenure in the Supreme Court, when the case is being here, he does not point out or nobody points out to a particular industry which has polluted that river. He says, yes, we all should be very clean. But nobody ever goes behind bars. There's a case of River Ganga which I think went on for 24 years, if I'm not mistaken. Not a single person was ever prosecuted. Not a single government officer was held liable for the fact that the river keeps deteriorating. The government does relatively similar things. The current government in Delhi, in his third tenure, when it came in his first tenure, started a program called Swachh Ganga. It did clean up the river. It did it by a good trick. It deleted the data on the cleaning of the river. That data did not come out on how the river looks clean or dirty. When it did come out, it showed that the river was as bad after spending another 15,000 crores as it was earlier. But again, nobody was liable for it. Nobody was ever held in this or various governments liable for the fact that that was our money spent on our environment supposedly to protect us and disappear. Each time we have this system, we end up contesting and saying, can we tweak the laws a little better? Can we tweak our regulatory systems a little better for them to be responsive to the needs of environmental justice? I would contend, and this is the second part of the conversation, that it is impossible to respond to the issues of environmental challenge by simply just looking at the environmental laws and the ways environment works. We require ourselves to look at the issue of how a democracy functions. In a society where, by default, for centuries you put more than half your population onto economic slavery under the caste system, where you deprived a fair percentage, a large percentage of your population and given it a moral justification by removing rights and access to resources to large number of people that you now call Dalits, tribals, underclasses, etc. In a society like that, the answer to degradation of environment and the wrong distribution of environment is not to fix the environment law. Because the environment law is only a function of how our democracy runs. And our democracy runs as it's recently concluded in the new elections that were held very recently, is funded by large money. It is funded by money of the volume that must essentially require a return on that investment. If I or you was an industrialist and if I was giving money to a politician to run his or her elections, I think to all of us it is clear it is like an investment. It is a very high-risk business investment that you and I make. And when I make it, I do hope that that politician gets elected by people. And if she does, then she has to pay back that money to me in a greater form with some profit, fair amount of margin. And because the risk bearance is very high on this money, that politician is required to give that back money fairly large profits to me. What does that politician, once elected and in positions of power, do? She or he then takes our national resources, takes what's available as nation's assets, and hands it over into the hands of some of these businessmen who fund. By default, the elected representative, the moment she or he reaches that chair of power, is indebted, and that debt has to be paid back. Our electoral processes run on this basic debt to the big finance. There's been a moral sanction to it. I don't think any one of us need to be told about how much cash floats in our systems when elections come around. Large rallies are held. So much money floats around, that there's economic research done to show that at this point there's a small bump that comes to Indian economy because so much new cash is floating around for contracts of different kinds and things being done across the country for political parties. Some years back in 2018-19, we reached, and I think Sharon was speaking of this work, we reached a point that till then, at least when businesses used to fund politicians, they used to do it with a little shame. They could not publicly go out and claim we had corrupted a politician. There was a pretense to it. There was in some sense a moral shame attached to it, but it went on very happily for years and years. In 2019, the then government, BJP government at center, headed by Prime Minister Nitin Sethi, tried to alter that as well. It said now it is fine and it is legal to not only businesses fund politicians, but they fund secretly, that they provide infinite amount of money to politicians and political parties without the citizens knowing how much money who's given to whom. And the only person who would come to know would be the person in power at the center. This was called the electoral bonds. Before this also we had enough corruption, cash flowing in the system. But what we then had by 2017, 18, 19, we had a system that said it's legally justifiable that in an Indian democracy, people or artificial entities who do not vote can give money to politicians without us coming to know what favors were done to them in return. Not only Indian entities, the provision said even foreign entities, companies based abroad, could provide funds to our politicians to run their electoral games without us coming to know. And what it promised to do was, it promised to make your and my vote redundant. What it promised to do was that these entities with sheer money could buy out elections, it could buy out people who are fighting these elections and basically control their lives once they got elected. It used to happen earlier also, I admit. But it would now happen under legal sanction. It was actually protected by law for people to bribe politicians at that scale. You and I could not. You and I could not give small bribe. We would continue to be called criminals if we did it. But if large corporations did it, it would now be morally, legally justifiable in the eyes of the law. That is the point we had reached. And it was parallel with what I think is parallel in the world of environment. An over-centralization of power in the world of politics. And a similar over-centralization of access and control over natural resources. If you look, the nature of how governance in electoral politics and how it's laid out in the environment, there seems to be similar reasons of why both are corroded. That instead of decentralization, what we got was very strong centers trying to accumulate capital, accumulate natural resources, and accumulate power over our lives. We've had some correction, I think, because of the roughly 2 percentage point shift in our voting patterns this year. But more or less, that's exactly where we continue to live. We continue to live in a place where, yet, most of our Dalit brethren, sisters, most of our communities which are marginalized, do not have access to resources, base resources, okay, produced resources. We provide ameliorative methods like reservation to compensate for that, or historically being deprived of access to these resources, of their access and rights to environment. Yet we have not achieved much on that count, if you look at it from one point of view. The other point of view is not been that bad also. Our laws and our state and our governments might have failed us, but if you look at how well our societies and our people have done, I am willing to bet compared to many other developing countries at the same stage of development, India's people have done much better to find justice and voice for themselves and try and build better systems of recovering their rights of environment from the people in power. If you look, and I was hearing this yesterday, Kerala has a great history of environmental fights going back to Silent Valley and others. The people in other parts of the country have done it. They've been thousands and millions of small environmental movements which may not know the word climate change, but they fought for their rights when the state did not provide it to them. They fought without so-called formal education or knowledge of science, etc. They simply fought on the basis of principles of justice and equity. And that has provided us some face-saving mechanisms. It has provided us some space where, despite so much economic growth, people continue to scamper, fight, and gather a little more than what they had a few decades ago. So, if you look at our environmental laws again, the environmental laws do not provide so much space to citizens. It's citizens' movements which have forced the state and the laws and the judiciary to bend over and give us a little more space that the lawmakers themselves wanted us to have. So even under the Environment Protection Act, where we are only consulted about how our air will be polluted, people's protests make sure projects do not come up very easily. It's not the law, it's the power of the people themselves protesting on ground which has ensured some semblance of democratic distribution of natural resources and some prevention of the corruption of the environment in India. And to me, if I look across other large emerging economies such as Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, what our people have achieved is fairly more than many others. And at this level of economic development, when most other nations in the global north, in the developed world, if you see, at this stage of development, when they were there, the cost to people was much higher. The levels of pollution and degradation of environment was much higher. We actually have achieved much, and that has been, to my view, because of a certain diversity of population, a certain diversity of our systems, a certain democratic way in which our diversity is managed itself. Therefore, when you find political class trying to also melt us all into one pot and call us by one name and call us all one people, one nation, one policy, one this, it is an attempt to do away with that basic structure of Indian society that prevents further degradation, that diversity of regulation, that democratic methods of village level control over your resources, sometimes communitarian levels of resources. Sometimes our ability to agitate, to come together at scales that the state finds very troublesome and irritating. But it prevents us from slipping down the dark hole where it might be very difficult to emerge from. And this brings me to the third part of my conversation. On top of all this, which we've already gone through from the day of our independence till recent, then there is this new challenge of what's called climate change. Nowadays, a lot of people, and all of us, I think, in some point or the other, start calling it climate crisis or a climate change emergency. And I would like to suggest to you that the word climate change emergency or crisis is extremely, extremely complicated and worrisome. That actually calling it a climate change emergency means further hurting our poor rather than saving them in the name of climate change. and I'll, in the next 10-15 minutes before I close, try to justify what I'm saying. That we should be very wary of thinking that there is some crisis happening. Because whenever in our minds, we've gone through political emergencies as well, some of our elders will remember that era. Whenever we think of emergency as a phrase, emergency comes with a demand. The term emergency comes with a demand, says act now. There is no time left. And we hear a lot of these conversations around the issue of climate change. A lot of people, posters, graphics will talk about there is no time, act now on climate change. When you say act now, the second unsaid sentence is act at all costs. Now this is an emergency, this is a priority in your life, you must act right now. Forget what cost somebody has to pay. What it does is, when you act in a way that you're acting to an emergency, somebody is still paying the price for what actions you are doing. That price is again paid by the same poor people who was initially suffering the worst of climate change. When you think of it like an emergency rather than think of it like a structural problem of our economy and democracy, you end up in the hands of the people who actually want to exploit the crisis for greater profits. It's like a double whammy. I'll give you a perfect example of this. This is not a theoretical supposition. You have, and I think all of us here would agree, because you're readers of Keraleeyam, more educated readers than I think people who read just general newspapers. We all, I think, would agree that the burning of coal causes emissions that should not exist. We should reduce the use of coal in generating power in coming years. And we all know that where the coal grows in at least Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, parts of Madhya Pradesh, these are lands which are forested lands where most of our tribal populations of central India live. Therefore, they are displaced and they are thrown out when the land under their feet is dug out for coal. So there's a fair call to be made that yes, both it pollutes because it causes carbon dioxide emissions when it's burned. It should be stopped. It should also be stopped because once it stops, people's land in these areas would not be taken away from them. They would be not so much valued by profit-making enterprises to throw away the tribals and take their forests out. But if you were to do it tomorrow itself, let's imagine a scenario where Prime Minister Modi or somebody picks up and says, tomorrow morning, because there is a climate emergency, let me stop production of coal. Or let's say day after. Now what it does, practically, and this is where we come back to the argument of contestations. It will basically say the only livelihood that existed for the most poor, displaced people in these regions would also shut down tomorrow morning. Because where would the solar energy come from? The solar energy will not come from Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. That would come from the western side of India. So the economic growth that you would see thereafter would be in these lands. But we would say, at all costs we must shut down coal. The costs would be borne by the same tribal population that was doing some livelihood, horrible livelihood, I agree, living miserable life, or at least living that life. What we would end up doing is taking away even that little that they had, shutting down that economy in the name of saving our lungs. Because we are now bothered about climate change. And the economy would move to a new world where none of them could be employed. If they could be employed in manual labor, they could not be employed in maintaining the solar panels. So the solar panels would be maintained by more educated people, more resourceful people in other geographies. And the tribals and others in these areas which are anyway impoverished, which face a resource crunch to begin with, would now face a double whammy. And this would be the cost of thinking of climate change as an emergency, of saying we must act on climate change at any cost. Because every time somebody makes a fool of us and says we must do this at any cost, he's basically trying to hoodwink us into paying the cost for it. There is a cost for every economic choice we make. Somebody has to pay that cost. The poor and the marginal and the tribals and the Dalits have already paid it enough for the last few centuries. If you act upon climate change with haste, without keeping the same principles in mind, that the principles of equity, principles of justice, If you act on climate change as an emergency, you land up in the same position where you were years ago. And I can give you a perfect example from a story that a colleague of mine, Tapasya, did in Uttarakhand. It's a hill state with lots of rivers which are seasonal as well as perennial. There's been a huge running debate in Uttarakhand that a lot of river mining is done for boulders, sand, etc., which I presume is also done over here. So some environmentalists went to court and said, no, this is unfair, you're digging out too much. The rivers are dying, getting killed, construction, there's floods happening because of sediment being removed. The state government said, no, we are doing this for climate change. We are doing this to actually take out the debris from the river so the river is contained, because climate change is altering everything. So under the Uttarakhand government's formal policy, its response to climate change is digging the rivers even more. And it has been justified so far. The state itself has appropriated this hashtag that we like to use for climate change to do the same thing that it continued to do earlier. It has actually become a defense for the state, because when we also continue to say everything is about climate change, every disaster that happens is about climate change, what we end up doing is taking away the responsibility of the state to have provided basic good governance. The floods you suffered in Kerala in 2018, the floods we suffer in Arunachal or Assam every year. It's quite fair that climate change exacerbates and makes it worse. But if our governments were answerable to us for what they do, they would have done better management of the cities to begin with. We would not have construction in our wetlands that would destroy the wetlands and then flood our lives. We would not have mad, rapid development of dams in fragile hills that would destroy our lives. That did not require climate change to come. That only required better governance. Very often, and these days, at least in North India, we were facing this heat wave, so to say, temperatures reached 50 degrees plus. Elites like us were very troubled. Daily wage people who had to work continued to work because they had no option. Many of them, therefore, obviously died or felt heat stroke at volumes that we've never seen before. And many of us wrote saying Dalits and tribals are at the forefront of climate change and the impacts of climate change. Quite true, because they are the poorest and the most marginalized. But the solution to that was not fixing climate change. The solution to that was bringing justice, equity, and distribution of wealth to the Dalits and tribals who begin with. If they were better off, if they did not need to work every day in the sun, regardless of what the weather is, they would do much better. So when you blame climate change and only heat waves for the fact that they are out on the road, you actually give government at times an excuse to continue doing what they do. In many cases, what is environmental degradation, what is the lack of environmental rights of our citizens in this country, has very little to do with climate change. The perversion called caste system has nothing to do with climate change. That to me is much more debilitating for centuries now. It has kept our people away from their rights, their access to resources. To me, solving that would solve half the population's challenges of facing climate change. It would give them more power, rights, resources to do it themselves rather than us act as environmentalists to protect them. And I'll end with this anecdote that a friend of mine says, which is cynical in some ways, but useful to think of as perhaps a canvas. You look at all of us, including I, who work on issues of environment from decades supposedly. And I've seen this across history from Chipko movement, which happened in Uttarakhand, where I lived at that time. All of us who were environmentalists, we began sometime from very basic livelihood levels. We didn't come from very places of great wealth. But all of us, mostly who worked on issues of environment, we have become upper class environmentalists. All of us have gained. My clothes are much better, my income levels are much better than they were 20 years ago. The people who suffered the cost of bad environment, their situation has not improved. There is something odd about how Indian environmentalism works, that all environmentalists seem to be doing better after 2 decades. But the people who live with the environment don't seem to be doing any better. There is a fundamental flaw in this. And if you do not address it, we are not again addressing the fundamental inequities in our society. It has very little to do, again, I would insist, with climate change. It is to do with the basic functions of democracy in India. It has to do with the basic social structures that we have built, which in some sense is economic slavery and it continues to be dictated. Climate change has only come on top of it to make it sound worse because it's impacting our lives, even the elites now. And if you look at the parallel in the political processes, in the last election, a lot of opposition parties have fought for protection of constitution. Many of them, at least publicly campaigned saying this is a fight to protect the constitution. But you look at the same constitution. If you look at pre-BJP also, it did not provide protection to many Dalits or tribals. We had a UPA, we had an APSPA which was applicable to citizens of India, where they were treated as second-rate citizens with the approval of the Supreme Court, where none of you and I also bothered about it. We were quite fine because these laws, in the way they treat you as second-rate citizens, was not applied to you and I. It was applied to people who lived on the margins. Therefore, in Kudankulam, you had 10,000 cases of sedition being filed against people. You had thousands being arrested, thousands of secret killing under APSPA in the northeast. You had people being picked up and operations being run in tribal areas of Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, where people would be killed point blank, women raped, and young men disappeared. Thousands of cases of this existed even while we had supposedly the constitution well in place. This constitution even then was not serving the poor and the marginal well enough. Why we got troubled, this is my theory and some of my friends might disagree. We got troubled with this problem only when the weakness of the constitution also came home to bite us. When we found that these cases of UAPA can not only be filed against the tribals and the Muslims and the marginals, it might even be filed against me. That I stay in Delhi am also not safe enough anymore. And that is when we suddenly realize that the constitutional values must be protected. If you see the environmental methods and the way our environmental debates are run, more or less I find a great similarity there. I find while the damage to the environment and the exploitation of natural resources only impacted our tribals and Dalits, we really did well. We were quite fine. This climate change in addition has brought this harm home. It is you and I who every day now face the same 50-degree heat like the poor person does. I have some protection with my air conditioning, but it doesn't last beyond my room. I also suffer it. My children also suffer asthma attacks when they live in Delhi. Just like the poor suffered elsewhere, working the mines in Chhattisgarh to doing our code. And that is what has got us worried about environment. There is a certain elite, upper class approach to why we are born. And I'm not trying to hold us guilty. I'm just saying we must recognize it. That this might be the trigger for us today. But the solution to these things is, again, as it is in mainstream politics and other issues of democracy, is responding to basic principles of justice and unfairness in our practices of democracy. You solve that, you will solve and empower a lot of poor people to take care of themselves rather than find saviors in us. There will be fewer need for people like us to lecture. There will be more of them who stand up for themselves and tell us how they protected themselves when we failed them. Is there hope? There is immense hope. While you and I speak and we act now in emergency and we get concerned about it, the fact is the person who gets hurt by the loss of environment, by expropriation of environment, stands up for herself and himself. We see it in forms of these movements and agitations. But the fact is the average citizen in India, which is not you and I, but people who live closer to nature, dependent more on nature, have fought for their rights with their back to the walls. With very limited resources, they have stood up, and therefore you have these vast histories of people protecting pockets when they need to. From all the way from Chipko movement, which turned into this great environmentalist movement, they may not have got much out of it for themselves, but they have held back India from going down a very dark slide. I don't think we celebrate these little pockets of, I don't call it revolution, but resistance of a certain kind that is the nature of state we have. I think we celebrate this over centralized form of environmentalism more. There is a need to recognize that much of what good has happened in Indian environment came from the poorest, because for them it was their life and livelihood. It's becoming ours as well. Some of us are unable to work in the days of get cornered and we send our children out to protest sometimes in towns about air pollution, etc. It's good. It's a start. I don't think it's a bad start. I don't think it's a point where you should be dismal about the country. I think we've done fairly well. We should stop looking for the hashtags that work in the English and the global word of climate change. No politician uses the word climate change. But no politician in India can survive unless he or she is catering to the basic needs of the people. Half, full, whatever. But no average elected politician can survive 2 terms unless he or he is provided food security, some nutritional security, some water security, some land rights. It is impossible. All those politicians, all those elected representatives really have been working on climate change far before we did. Before we discovered these terms, just that they don't use the same language. They do that. We need to make sure our democratic principles, methods are much better. That the nature of electoral politics changes, that they are more answerable to us, that the only way to win is to do this and not to divide us along religious lines. Because that is a quick dividend they get and they try and chew upon it. I think if we change the structures of how our politicians are chosen and elected, we find that environment is also safer. And we would not need to be called environmentalists, we just be called good citizens. And I think that's where we should be moving. Thank you for your patience.